This production of Wandering Through La Mancha, a Quixotic tale, forms part of the project Q.Theatre, theatrical recreations of Don Quixote in Europe, co-funded by Creative Europe, a funding initiative of the European Commission. I wrote this play about Don Quixote for the Q.Theatre project, of which I'm an academic collaborator. The project, in part, funds original theatrical productions of Don Quixote in the various countries who are collaborating on the project, including the United Kingdom. I wanted to have the British play really reflect what I felt were the most important aspects of Don Quixote: the structure, the themes, the narration, etc., all of which appear in this version. However, I looked and I couldn't find one that I felt was suitable, that accurately reflected what I wanted to be on stage. So, as I have done some creative writing in the past, I decided to take a stab at writing a play myself. I'd never written a play before, but once I began the process, it started to flow, and I got a first draft done quite quickly, and I was able to rework it, and the product is what we have here. The novel Don Quixote was published in two parts, 10 years apart from each other. Part 1 was published in 1605. The content of this play comes entirely from part 1 of the novel, and I wanted to choose the episodes that I felt would work best on stage, while also having a coherent story. Because the novel, in many ways, is a series of episodes that don't necessarily have to do with one another. They're a bit disconnected sometimes, with the main running theme of the novel being Don Quixote and Sancho and their adventures that they face, and perhaps more importantly, how we, the reader, react to those characters. So the main scenes that I wanted to include in part 1 of the play were, firstly, how this man becomes Don Quixote. Secondly, how he ends up befriending Sancho Panza, the local country bumpkin, so to speak, to become his squire, and how he convinces him that he's actually knight-errant and that he's going to be going on these adventures. Perhaps the most famous scene that's associated with Don Quixote is when he thinks that a windmill is a giant coming to attack. And it's quite comical. He runs after the windmill, or charges on his horse with the lance, and his lance gets stuck in the sail of the windmill and he gets thrown away. This is, as I said, probably the most famous episode associated with Don Quixote. Even though in the novel, which in most editions runs over 1,000 pages, this scene occupies less than 1 page of the novel. But I decided it would be a good idea to keep it in for that reason. I also wanted to include the scene of Marcella and Chrysostom. So this is the episode in which Marcella comes out and she gives a speech, and the speech, as I've written it in the play, comes almost word for word from the novel and the excerpts and chunks that I chose to include. And what it demonstrates is that this is a young woman who is beautiful and she's wealthy. However, she chooses not to get married. And the young man Chrysostom, who has died, the scene is his funeral, his friends blame her for not reciprocating that love, and that's the reason why he died. And she delivers an excellent speech about how she can't be blamed for men finding her attractive. And she chooses to live a solitary life. She chooses not to get married. And then she leaves the scene. In the novel, we never see her again. After that, the scene of Cardenio. Cardenio is the star-crossed lover. Cardenio, as a young man, befriended Don Fernando, and he went to work for the family of Don Fernando, who is a higher social class than Cardenio. And he was telling Don Fernando all about his lady love, Lucinda. And he regaled her beauty, and when Don Fernando set eyes on her, he decided to take her for himself, thus abandoning Dorothea, who was his love interest, whom he had already pledged himself to marry. So Cardenio has gone mad, as it says in the novel, and he's up in the mountains, and that's where Don Quixote sees him. And this starts an episode of Don Quixote, which in the novel spans several chapters. But in this scene, it's all condensed into one. And they all 4 characters end up seeing each other again. Lucinda wants to go back with Cardenio. Don Fernando sees Dorotea and falls in love with her again. And in the novel, they all get married and they go off and live happily ever after. However, in my version, I decided that Dorotea, after having been abandoned by Don Fernando for another woman, decides that she doesn't need a man, and she actually punches him in the face and storms off to applause from everybody else. In the scene in which Don Quixote and Sancho come across galley slaves and they're all enchained and being led towards the sea, he engages them in conversation, and he's curious to see why they have all been chained up. And through their manipulation of him and his perhaps lack of understanding of what's going on, he decides that they've all been imprisoned against their will. And Sancho and Don Quixote then overtake the two guards who are guarding them, and they release the prisoners, and the prisoners flee. In the scene with the canon of Alcalá de Henares, which in the novel he's the canon of Toledo, but because Alcalá de Henares is the birthplace of Cervantes, I decided to alter it a bit. In this scene, the canon approaches, and in the novel, this is a scene in which many scholars believe to be Cervantes' own view of dramatic theory and literary theory. The canon discusses knights of chivalry and the tales of knights of chivalry, and he deplores them as being false tales that can lure people into immoral behavior. But of course, like most censors, and let's keep in mind that as Cervantes was writing this episode in Don Quixote, that the Inquisition was in charge of censorship in Spain, and it was quite strict. But like most censors, when they censor a book, they probably haven't read it. So the canon of Alcalá de Henares, even though he deplores these tales of knights of chivalry, he's never really read one. And in fact, he's begun writing one of his own, and he's got 100 pages into it. He also discusses theater and how horrible the theater is, and it's just full of prostitutes and thieves and people wanting to steal your money. And the idea behind writing this scene as I've written it is that, of course, he's talking to an audience in the theater. And he says the worst part about the theater is that it's full of theater goers. So this is a scene in which, reflecting the scene in Cervantes' novel, that it shows the clergy, it shows the church in a critical light, in a satirical manner. At the end of the first part of Don Quixote, his neighbors and his friends are really trying to get him back home. And in the novel, they end up trapping him inside a big wooden cage, and they take him back to his village in this wooden cage. Now, this is a scene that in many theatrical versions has been reproduced. However, I felt that as I was creating my own version, that putting a man that today we might consider to be have mental health issues, somebody who needs to be believed and treated with respect, should not be shoved into a cage. So I decided instead to create another diversion where they convinced Don Quixote that a giant was coming to destroy his village, and they got him to walk home under his own power. So the final scene of this play has Don Quixote at home in his bed. His friends and his niece are congratulating themselves for getting him home safely, that he hasn't hurt himself, he's still alive, and he's still in one piece. But in the background, the man becomes Don Quixote again. Once he hears that name, he starts to become Don Quixote again, and he wants to go off on his new adventures. He feels his mission is not complete, and he gets Sancho to come with him, and the play ends with him and Sancho going off to find their next adventure. Many theatrical productions of Don Quixote end with his death, and this is what occurs at the end of part 2 of the novel. However, I decided that in order to keep it with a more comedic tone, instead of having him die, is to have him become Don Quixote again and leave the audience wondering what's going to happen next as Don Quixote and Sancho walk off into the sunset looking for their next adventures.